panel from the CLF Alberta team. So we're happy to welcome everybody today. Always just a reminder that you can check out carbonleadershipforum.org for tons of information about carbon projects, resources, toolkits, all types of information from policies to benchmarking work. So much to be found on that website. So just wanted to make sure to remind everyone to check out that. And then, of course, that we have all our previous, specifically to Alberta, talks, webinars, lunch and learns, etc. on our website. So those are all posted through our YouTube channel and linked there. So we'll get right to it, and I'll introduce our moderator, our co-founder for CLF Alberta, and that is Ignacio from Lehigh. Please take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. Just a quick check. Everyone can hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. Well, hello and welcome to our second panel discussion of the year, Reducing Embodied Carbon Emissions in Concrete. As Kristen alluded, my name is Ignacio Cariaga. I'm a co-founder of CLF Alberta and work for Lehigh Cement as a senior technical service manager and have over 25 years of experience in the cement and precast concrete industry, with a specific focus on sustainability and developing low carbon solutions. It's an honor and privilege to moderate such a distinguished group of panelists representing major points of the concrete value chain today. I will now ask each panelist to introduce themselves and ask them to share what role they have to play in the reduction of embodied carbon in concrete. So let me start by asking Sarah Petrevan from Cement Association of Canada, who is representing the cement and concrete suppliers. Sarah?
Thanks, Ignacio. So I'm Sarah Petrevan, Director of Sustainability for the Cement Association of Canada. We represent cement companies within Canada and work together to advance policies and programs of interest to our industry. So our industry has a major role to play in reducing emissions in the cement and concrete value chain. We are the source of emissions overwhelmingly. Cement amounts to about 7 to 8%, depending on the source, of global emissions. In Canada, we make up about 1.5% of Canada's total emissions. And so there is a huge opportunity in cement. When you decarbonize cement, you decarbonize the entire value chain. And so, you know, the good news is that our industry as a whole is deeply committed to reducing our emissions and achieving net zero by 2050. We have engaged with the federal government on a decarbonization roadmap to 2030 for our industry. So we've committed to reducing emissions by 15 megatons cumulatively between now and 2030. And then on a drive to net zero after that. And we're making this effort, we're launching this effort focused on technologies and information that's available to us today. So we're very focused. We're not hinging our bets on things that may come down the road. We're looking at what we can do today based on what is available today to help us reach net zero and true net zero. So we're not going to be using a lot of offsets to do this. We're looking at reaching true net zero.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sarah. Look forward to hearing more. So let me go next to David Pesta from Dialog, representing the design community. David?
Thanks, Ignacio. So as Ignacio said, I'm David Pesta, structural engineer and associate with Dialog in Dialog's Calgary studio. For those of you who aren't familiar, Dialog is a multidisciplinary design firm with studios in Canada and the United States that includes architects, engineers, planners, and designers. So I myself hold a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Engineering specializing in structures from the University of Calgary. And relevant to this conversation, I'm also leading Dialog's structural sustainability initiatives. So sustainability is really core to what we do here at Dialog. And a few of the things that we've been working on in the last little while with regards to embodied carbon. Last year, we signed on to the SE 2050 commitment program, which is a commitment to achieve net zero embodied carbon in our structures by 2050, which as part of that, we've established an embodied carbon action plan which outlines our strategy to achieve that goal. We've also been working with industry, with our partners in ready mix suppliers, the Canadian Cement Association, and the National Research Council to develop best practices for specifying and procuring low carbon concrete. And we're working on internally a LCA framework as a guide to help our teams develop and understand methods to reduce embodied carbon in our projects. And I think as an integrated firm, we recognize that embodied carbon is not just, for example, a structural engineering problem. We have the opportunity to take a collaborative approach to reducing embodied carbon in our structures. And I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today on how we can engage with our partners in industry to make that happen.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Well, let's go next to Jen Hancock from Chandos Construction, representing the general contractors.
Great, thanks, Ignacio. So I'm Jen Hancock. I'm the Vice President of Collaborative Construction with Chandos. As many of you may or may not be familiar with Chandos, but we're like a commercial general contractor. We work from Alberta, from BC all the way to Ontario. And we do anything from schools to wastewater treatment plants all over the map. So my role as the Vice President of Collaborative Construction, I look after lean efficiency and productivity, sustainability, climate initiatives for the company, as well as integrated project delivery and other collaborative delivery methods. So this kind of a mixed bag of stuff. And I just wanted to maybe highlight a couple of things that we're working on right now that is really in my focus, and why this panel is really timely in terms of some of the stuff I've been thinking about and we've been thinking about internally. Last year, we as a company made a commitment to be net zero carbon by 2040. And so what we define that, just to give us some context and where I'm sort of working through all the details right now, we have done greenhouse gas emissions tracking on our operations for scope 1, 2, and part of 3 for the last couple of years. And what we realized is our greenhouse gas emissions, we weren't thinking about, we hadn't put buildings into that yet. So scope 3s that we were calculating was things like, flights, hotels, commuting, and waste. We were not thinking about the buildings piece of it yet, of our supply chain. And so what we've added into our net zero 2040 commitment is the embodied carbon of the buildings we build, which is a huge nut to crack. And so basically what that means is by 2040, every building we build after that will need to be net zero carbon emissions, whether our clients want it or not. So that is, it's a huge, as you can imagine, it's a huge task to try to figure where that is. So that's our goal. This year, one of the things we're focusing on, and we will be focusing on with many of our partners along the way, because as David said, there's lots of partners along the value chain there. We're starting to do life cycle assessments on our buildings to really understand impacts. Concrete is a huge piece of that for the work that we do, and starting to figure out how we're going to track that and get that information disseminated to our sites and to our teams so that every year we can slowly reduce kind of emissions over time every year. So it'll be a bit of a percentage reduction. So I'll leave it at that, but this panel is very timely for me because it's something that it's heavily in what I'm thinking about almost daily, and the work that we're doing and trying to push ourselves forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Quite ambitious, but really nice to hear. So let's go now to, last but not least, Atul Paranjape from City of Calgary, representing the owners. Atul?
Thanks, Ignacio. So my name is Atul Paranjape. I'm a senior structural and building envelope engineer within the corporate engineering division of City of Calgary. So my primary role with this, with the city, is we look after the city-owned buildings. We are also responsible for maintaining and updating the City of Calgary funded buildings. So there's a design guidelines that we maintain. But the City of Calgary also plays a dual role, if you want to call it. We are one of the largest asset owners in terms of the built infrastructure, the buildings, the sidewalk, where we use a lot of concrete. Plus, we also have the second hat is the authority having jurisdiction, where we develop bylaws. We come up with the policies that would affect not just the city building, but the entire the construction community. So I guess this panel is very timely because for the last several years, we continue to work with the city's sustainability group as well as our climate group. But the focus has always been on the operational carbon, but not a lot about the embodied carbon. So with this panel and the discussion, my hope is to continue bringing more learnings and awareness about the embodied carbon and materials, and specifically concrete.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Atul. So now, as you can see, we're extremely fortunate today to have such an incredible group of panelists representing the entire concrete value chain, starting from the supply of concrete and cement and concrete, to the designing community, to the general contracting, all the way to the owners. So it's a great opportunity for us to really hone in onto the needs and wants of the owner and how we're going to breach the gaps. So consistent with our CLF mission to educate about the importance of reducing embodied carbon, we want to make sure that today's panel discussion will bring value to everyone. For this reason, we have designed the panel discussion with only 2 rounds of questions that each panelist will answer, allowing us plenty of time to have the panelists answer questions from the audience. So I would kindly invite everybody to use the Q&A chat function in Zoom to submit your question, and please specify if the question is for a specific panelist or for all. I will ask my colleague Christine to manage these questions as they come forward. Before we start the first question, I'd like to share a couple of slides that the panelists and I thought it would be important to bring some important facts to light and to set the stage for our dialogue. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen and we will proceed accordingly. Okay, if I can just confirm that you guys see this screen. Good. Okay, perfect. So I know that we have started with many CLF Alberta presentations in the past, and we have all the terminology down packed. And for some reason you haven't seen that, please again go back to our resources in our website. It has a lot of presentations. All the presentations are there in the slides, so you can go through the terminology. But I did want to sort of rephrase some of the quick facts that are important and relative to what today's discussion is going to be, which is concrete. A few quick facts are cement, as Sarah alluded to, is 7 to 8% of global emissions. And in Canada, in fact, in North America, it represents 1.5% of the North American emissions. Cement emissions is basically carried by 2 major streams. One is composed of 1/3 of the emissions come from combustion emissions, and 2/3 of the emissions come from process emissions. Needless to say that combustion emissions can and are being dealt with, for example, alternative fuels and the use of biomass. However, the process emissions, which come from calcination, is hard to abate emissions. And that's why we really need to work on everything today and the technology of tomorrow. The other thing is that not only we recognize that cement, and for that reason, concrete is a emission intensity industry, it's the other piece of it is that we are seeing a growing demand in construction. So for that reason, it's sort of a double whammy that we need to address, and we can't wait. We need to address it today. New construction's growth, for example, according to Architectural 2030, is the equivalent of adding an entire New York City to the world every month for 40 years. So just keep those numbers in mind. I did want to show a little bit of what the whole carbon life cycle looks like. I know that many of you have seen this before, but just to look at the different stages, the product stage, which involves the extraction of raw materials, transportation, and manufacturing. The construction process stage, which is the delivery of the product to the site, and the actual construction. Then you have use stage, operational stage, and end of life stage. And I will certainly go through the product stage here in more detail. So if you look at the product stage, the first pie chart on the left, you can see that if you break out the embodied carbon by life cycle, A1 to A3, which is the upfront stage in materials, is by far the largest one. And if you were to break down that A1 to A3, furthermore, in a typical building, the A1 to A3 materials is mostly driven by concrete. As you can see on the right, the pie chart is over 52% in concrete. And within that concrete, cement is made up of 85 to 95% of that emissions. So one of the things that we like to do is, okay, now we've looked at the concrete being a major contributor to embodied carbon in a typical building. So let's look at it further. If I were to break down concrete in terms of the carbon emission intensity, it's broken up in 3 parts. A1 is the extraction, A2 is the transportation, and A3 is manufacturing. As you can see, A1 is the driver, and it's because cement is included in there. As you can see on the blue piece, cement obviously carries the most intensity. And then on the transportation side, interesting enough, it is not cement, but it's the aggregates. So transportation of the aggregates is the driver on A2. However, in magnitude wise, it's not compared nowhere near to cement, but it's important to know that it is the second one. If I were to break down the cement now into how things can be reduced, or how can we substitute the cement, which is the carbon intensive portion of it, is we have a few ways. As you can see in the industry, Portland limestone cement has become quite popular now and is mostly used now throughout North America. And that can have an opportunity to reduce up to 10% of the emission intensity. Then you have SCMs, or supplementary cementitious materials, which can reduce 20 to 40% carbon intensity. And you have other technologies like carbon mineralization, which have a smaller effect, but although important and in a way to reduce emissions. So I just want to provide this clarity, which will set the stage for our conversation. So let me now go back to and start the round of questions. So we will begin with the first question, which is, what are some successes? And this is the first question. I'll start with Sarah. What are some successes and gaps that you have seen today in your role as representing suppliers for reducing embodied carbon in concrete?
Okay, so some successes that we've seen. So I think the problem by our industry is not only well understood. I mean, Ignacio, your slides leave no question, right? That cement is the big challenge and the big question when we are talking about reducing embodied carbon in concrete. It's also where the biggest opportunity is. So a success is that is well understood by our companies and our industry, and that there is a great deal of alignment and commitment by each of our member companies to figure out ways to reduce their emissions. Whether that be looking at lower carbon or alternative fuel sources, to engaging in pilot programs and demonstration programs on new technologies, whether it be carbon capture, utilization and storage, direct air capture, carbon mineralization technologies. Like there's all sorts of different examples at play. We're also aligned as an industry where we're supporters of carbon pricing and recognize the need to reduce our emissions. We are, as you said, concrete is the second most used material in the world after water. You do need concrete as part of building a climate resilient future globally. And so, it's really on us to figure out how we can do that in a way that lets us build not only lower carbon communities, but also climate resilient communities. So, that's what I really see our successes is alignment around the challenge and a very deep commitment to solving the challenge. I think there's going to be a lot of exciting a lot of exciting projects and initiatives coming out of our industry in the next couple of years.
Perfect. Sorry, Sarah, some of the gaps that you see?
Gaps. Haha. Sorry. Okay, gaps. So, I think the most obvious gap that everybody is going to expect me to talk about is the technology gap. And maybe just to say briefly, right? So, there are some alternative fuels out there. Do we have enough? Is there going to be enough supply? How does the alternative fuels market change as increased demand for alternative fuels comes from other industries? We could talk about supplementary cementitious materials, right, which we get from waste from other industries, and how does that change as we stop burning so much coal, or there are changes in the steel industry. Challenges around the economics of full-scale carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I think the technology one is is an important gap, and I think it's one that is becoming more and more well understood. But I really want to focus my time today in talking about a gap that is less well understood, and this is what I call the public policy gap, particularly as it relates to codes, standards, and procurement. So maybe let me set this up in a way that will enable me to answer the next question, which is really to talk about how we solve the gap. So in short, industry through public policy is being asked to decarbonize, and rightly so, whether it be through standards like around clean fuel standards or low carbon fuel standards. They're called different things in other jurisdictions, to carbon pricing. We have received the message loud and clear that it is time for us to reduce our emissions, and we are very willing to do that. However, the challenge becomes that as an industry, we are now producing lower and lower carbon goods. So we are producing low carbon concretes. But the challenge is to find a buyer for those low carbon materials and to potentially pay the price premium that comes with them. And lower carbon concrete could mean differences in pouring schedule or differences in curing time, and working with both the public and private sector to understand how the imperative for lower carbon modifies our industry is an ongoing challenge. Certainly, with the emergence of procurement policies in the European Union, even in the United States through Buy Clean, you're seeing an overwhelming trend towards public policymakers understanding that they have a responsibility to lead markets in terms of putting their money where their mouth is, right? The only way we're going to do anything differently is by starting to buy things differently. And so that is really where the gap is in Canada, is a public policy gap between policies that ask us to decarbonize, but at the same time haven't correspondingly purchased the lower carbon materials that industry is producing.
Perfect. Great. Well, we'll look forward to the second round to hear more about that. Okay, so let me turn it over now to David. The same question for you from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the big successes we've had is the fact that we're even here today talking about this. If you look back even a couple of years ago, I'm sure some of us may have known about embodied carbon, but it wasn't really a hot topic, and it wasn't really well discussed or understood from a designer's perspective, at least, the impact that we had on embodied carbon. So echoing Sarah's point, it's really great to see that industry has recognized the impact of their products, cement and concrete, on embodied carbon, and the fact that there's a unified commitment from producers and suppliers to produce EPDs, produce lower carbon concrete, and to make those available on the market. Some of the challenges I see or gaps that I've seen in my practice, there's some inconsistency in the way that baselines are discussed and developed from market to market, and how those are applied to calculating reductions. And for example, how we get some reasonable baselines in each of our projects. And then also there's even still a varying degree of understanding and urgency that each of our clients or our contractors or our colleagues have regarding embodied carbon. So there's, I think, some effort needed to bring kind of everyone onto the same page to valuing the effort needed to address embodied carbon, and really understanding the importance of dealing with this in a timely manner. And then from a designer's perspective, really educating our peers in what they can do, even starting today, to make meaningful impacts to the embodied carbon on their projects.
Perfect, great, well said, David. Okay, so let's go on to Jen from the general contractor's point.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I would on the successes echo both Sarah and David's comments there. Maybe one other success outside of that too is just, I mean, David mentioned the commitment that Dialog has made. There's a lot more companies making commitment to, you know, whether it's science-based targets or net zero commitments. That I think is huge. It's sort of the piece that'll start driving businesses to, you know, start thinking more about embodied carbon. I also think that's a great success is that there are companies that aren't waiting. You know, we do have some policy gaps, and we see that coming, but there's companies that aren't waiting to be told that they have to do this. So they're making those commitments and saying, we're going to do it, regardless of whether the policy is there, we're going to try to do it. And I think that's also really important. There's so many more groups jumping on board there. Then on the gap side, I guess, again, kind of similar, I think one of the big gaps on our side, so I think there's, you know, an education gap for sure. So understanding what kinds of decisions can, you know, I make as a general contractor, other general contractors, or as if you're a trade, what kinds of decisions can you make that would lower your carbon footprint, and thinking about the embodied carbon piece. How can we make that easy for our teams to be able to do that work? They have so many things that they're thinking about constantly, that how do we make that an easy process for them to make those decisions? So if they're thinking about concrete in particular, how are they making the best choices? I've got, you know, one example where we tend to obviously put productivity really high. We've got one project where the designers wanted to have a thicker slab edge, not as thick in the middle, so that we had a little bit less product on concrete side. And, you know, someone from the team was like, oh, well, can we just make it the same thickness all the way? It'll be easier. And so that was like, oh, okay, sure, let's try do that, but not thinking about it's going to have higher embodied carbon. The more product you have, the higher embodied carbon it is. So just some of those decisions, just education pieces, the person they were doing that thinking about what might be easier on the construction side, which we do absolutely need to factor in productivity and thinking about constructability, but that can't be the only driver. And it's because, so we need to educate on that piece. I think the other thing, you know, that is missing right now, and designers are doing some great work on the embodied carbon side. We're seeing suppliers doing incredible work on that space. As evidence, concrete is one example where there's some really great innovations happening inside the industry that is, you know, it's making it a lot easier for general contractors to be able to purchase lower carbon concrete. But the thing is some of the decisions that we might be able to make that helps to lower the carbon impact, I don't think our contracts right now do a great job of allowing us to necessarily make those decisions. So if you think about if you've got a lump sum contract, what is your motivation in a lump sum contract when you're delivering a project? Do you want to, you know, choose the concrete that cures a little bit longer but has a lower carbon impact, but it might impact your schedule, and then you get hung up with costs of that? So I actually think a gap right now is that we still deliver a lot of projects in a lump sum manner. And I don't think that is, if we want to talk about lowering carbon, those contracts are not the best methodology for us to be able to have collaboration between what the designers are hoping to get out of the end and maybe an owner, and what the contractor can understand and can actually execute or is willing to risk executing, because there may be some risk to schedule. So I think a gap is our contracts. And then I do think, and that the contracts actually don't allow groups like Dialog or other firms to then be able to probably communicate as clearly some of the decisions about why they want to do the work. There's always a concern is the price going to be higher because we put this in the specification? And when we lump sum contract that, how are we going to know if the price is artificially high because the person just didn't understand what was required. And so I know there's collaboration happening with designers and industry, but I do think that we need more in the middle so that we can actually make better choices all the way through the whole value chain, start to finish, from owner, designer. And even if an owner is not, it's not something they want, if we have more collaborative contracts, it's stuff that we can start talking about because we know it's important, regardless of whether our owner wants that or not. We can just give it to them. But we need that set up in the first place. So those are a couple of things I would say are major gaps right now, but some really also great successes. I mean, again, the fact that we're talking about this right now and that industries like cement and concrete are doing some really amazing work on the innovation side is also a huge win.
Perfect. Thanks, Jen. Interesting points that perhaps we don't think about contracts. Okay, let me go back now to Atul. Atul, if you can share your point of view from the owner's perspective.
Sure. As Sarah said, I think industry is well aware of the challenges and gaps in terms of the embodied carbon in concrete. From my perspective, the owner or the government side of things, I think the Europeans were about 10 years ahead compared to the North America, where countries like Germany and Netherlands have started enforcing and mandating the calculations and reporting of the embodied carbon in concrete and other materials. As far as in North America is concerned, I would say, a Marin County in California, they recently placed the embodied carbon limits on concrete. And also it became a part of the California Building Standards Code that required the environmental product declarations of concrete. Similarly, a state of Hawaii passed the law recently that required the carbon dioxide mineralized concrete for all of city projects. On the north of the border, I would say there are some Canadian municipalities such as City of Toronto requires the material emissions assessment for structural and building envelope components and identify the low carbon alternative to proposed structure or envelope through Toronto Green Standard. Also, the City of Vancouver has the Green Buildings Policy for rezoning that require all projects report a life cycle equivalent of an embodied carbon. So in terms of the City of Calgary, we have a sustainable building policy, but our ultimate aim is to maybe start incorporating some of the embodied carbon reporting requirements in there. So those are some of the successes that I've seen in Canada and in US. In terms of the gaps, I would say there are two major gaps that I can flag. Locally, the City of Calgary do not currently have a policy on the embodied carbon in material. So that's number one. And the number two is the building code, the National Building Code, Alberta edition, as well as the concrete code currently do not require any calculations or reporting on carbon emissions. So I'll leave it at that now.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Good points, Atul. Okay, so now let's start the second round. And if I could ask again, go back to Sarah. Now, if you could maybe share some of the recommendations you would have to bridge the gap that you mentioned on the first round. Sarah?
Thanks, Ignacio. So, I think the gap is well understood by all of my co-panelists. Certainly, things that David, Jen, and Atul mentioned all speak to the policy gap. What I think we need is codes and standards to recognize that embodied carbon is a goal and is an objective of something that we are trying to reduce. Right now, codes and standards are not reflective of the fact, or not reflective of the climate change imperative. They don't take into consideration the need to reduce carbon as part of what we're all trying to do in the building of infrastructure. So I think that's an important one. I think the other important one is that how, Jen was talking about contracts. How do we do contracts? How do we look at contracts? I would argue that switching to a performance-based standard is really the way to go. So rather than trying to prescribe how many tons of concrete you need at, on what day and what mix it needs to be, go out and say, look, I'm interested in this sort of project, and I'm interested in the lowest carbon option that you can provide me that fits within these parameters, and work in partnership with producers and with industry to innovate and bring forward the best possible solutions, and talk about, how does that impact the construction schedule? How does that impact the performance of the asset? And I think in creating a more collaborative approach and a more open approach where you can have ongoing discussions between the supplier and the proponent, you can really start digging down into some of these solutions. And then finally, I would say that we need public policy around low carbon procurement much, much, much more broadly. The federal government has committed to a Buy Clean strategy, committed to Buy Clean in the most recent budget, and they did it in as part of their this current government did it as part of their campaign commitment. We still have yet to see what that looks like, but we know that the purchase of lower carbon materials is not only good for meeting our climate objectives, but there are significant amount of economic benefits for Canadian industries, as globally competitors in the United States and the European Union all look to find ways to reduce their emissions as well. And we are an export-oriented economy. At a provincial level, which handles most or in large part of the infrastructure funding together with municipalities, there is a need to start looking at embodied carbon procurement policy, which is, invariably a challenge in the federal system that we have, and provinces and the federal government not always agreeing on what public policy should look like. And finally, Atul mentioned some of the great municipal leadership that we have in this country, but that needs to be expanded. And it is always a challenge, right, when you're working with different standards and different rules in different jurisdictions. And so, some sort of standardization or baseline understanding of what is the absolute minimum low carbon procurement policy that you need to have in place is going to be super important to solving this challenge.
Thank you, Sarah. Good points. Okay, so let's go to the design community. David?
So I guess I echo a few points that Sarah made, but maybe one that's a little bit different. As a designer, I think we really like to make information-based decisions when we're making our designs. So one of the gaps that I identified was it really having the information available for us to make these embodied carbon decisions. And I know the industry is heading, they have currently industry average, and I know they're heading towards producer-specific EPDs, which I think is a big help. But even beyond that, understanding what is actually the availability of these products. Was there a significant cost premium for what we're trying to achieve in our projects? Are they readily available? All that information I think would be really beneficial when we're trying to make our design decisions and trying to collaborate with our owners to describe what the impact is on the project. As we know, every project has a budget, and we're all trying to design within that budget. So understanding what the premium is to achieve these design goals, I think is imperative to coincide with the policy changes that Sarah mentioned. I think understanding from our perspective how much more a 70% reduction in embodied carbon, for example, is going to be versus a 30% reduction, and can help us make those informed decisions. Something that perhaps help with that is we're really pushing towards performance-based specifications for all of our projects at Dialog. And we really like this because it allows our industry partners, so the ready-mix suppliers or the contractors, to determine their best approach at achieving our embodied carbon reduction goals. And I think in previous presentations I've attended, that seems to be really appreciated by the construction industry. And frankly, I think it's the way to go. And then I guess the final point is that I think we need to have more of these conversations. As I mentioned earlier, it really is a collaborative effort to achieve these embodied carbon reductions. Understanding that sometimes using less material means more labor on site, for example. So what's the balance there? What's the cost associated with that? What's the schedule impact? So I think any way of getting all of the players in the room, having conversations early in the design, so that we can really balance the impacts of the decisions that we're trying to make for our projects.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Jan, would you like to share your bridging the gap options?
Sure. I mean, I think while I sort of mentioned, and again, Sarah's really covered it, and David, while we know we need policy changes that totally helps drive decisions. So, and while we're waiting for technology to catch up, like on the cement side of life, we know that a bunch of that is just emitted from the process of making cement. So while we're waiting for technology and policies to catch up, I think there's a piece that's an and also. So that's all happening over here. We have limited control over that. Although the more purchasing decisions we make, we start to drive demand for that. So we know that can help. I think while we're waiting for all that, what are the things that we can start to do in our own spheres of influence? And so what I think, I do absolutely think that, education is still a huge problem. There's a lot of us in our own spaces that, we talk about this, embodied carbon is a new space for our company. We're just kind of getting our head into doing life cycle analysis on projects. And so this is a new space for us, but education for our people. I know that when we start a project, it's always this rush to get into construction. Let's dive in and go. But if we actually can train to kind of do a bit of a pause and say, okay, what are some spaces where you might be able to influence the carbon? So while we're doing things like buyouts, while we're doing buyouts at the beginning and setting contracts with our trade partners, having those conversations about what low carbon decisions can you make before we start choosing a concrete supplier? What do you have for lower carbon concrete? What does that look like for cost for us? What are some decisions we might make about some of the performance so that we can have lower carbon concrete? I don't think that's not happening across the board. I don't think in industry at all right now. And so that needs to happen more. And so again, we need to make that easy for teams. Part of me is thinking checklists, their checklists are used in the medical field for pre-flight checklists, something that's really easy for people to go through that helps them make good decisions and check on the work. We can create sort of these pre-flight checklists for our teams and something specifically around concrete that can totally happen and help our teams make better decisions. That's something in our sphere of influence that is not going to get us to zero carbon concrete, but these are all steps that we can take to start to lower and reduce the impact of that. And I'll go back to, I still think we need absolutely to think more about how more collaborative project delivery can allow us to have these conversations at the right time, bringing the right voices and expertise to the table. Again, where suppliers are often not, on the concrete side, or many other suppliers are not brought to the table when they probably should be. And so I really think that has to be the case. We need to increase our collaborative project delivery. It'll help increase learning for everyone across the board, help us deliver better projects. And then when we want to make decisions that might impact schedule, we can do that as a team and figure that out as a team. So I guess those are all things for me that, as we're waiting for technology and policy to catch up, those are all not maybe low-hanging fruit, but things that are in our sphere of influence we can do and will absolutely make a difference. And we can start tracking that right away and start showing that impact.
Perfect. Thank you, Jen. Who would have thought checklists would be so powerful? Great. Atul, would you like to share yours, please?
Sure. Thanks, Ignacio. As said earlier, I think there are a number of steps I would say that can address the gap. I mean, policy development and enhancing the codes and standard is a long-term goal. But as Sarah said earlier, I think incorporating embodied carbon performance goals and reporting requirements in procurement policies for construction projects would certainly help that addressing the gap. I mean, the options could include whole building life cycle assessment, reporting, performance targets, or material specifications such as David mentioned, concrete with high cementitious contents for all new municipal building and infrastructure projects. The city can also consider adding embodied carbon reporting requirements to zoning and other building related bylaws, similar to what City of Toronto had done. And a city can also require projects to quantify and report total carbon footprint, which is operational as well as the embodied under the National Building Code, as well as consider future performance targets. And lastly, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, as an asset owner, because we have a few thousand buildings, I would say, as an asset owner, city could show the leadership by requiring all the new construction or the life cycle project design teams to calculate, report, and reduce the embodied carbon in concrete and other materials before any official policy come into effect.
Thank you, Atul. I hope that's a promise. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Well, we've heard from the experts, and it's quite encouraging to see that there are ways to bridge the gaps. So thank you very much to all. And now I'd like to open up the floor for some questions. Kristen, you have been receiving some, if you'd like to maybe point them out.
Yeah, some great questions so far. One is the first comment, looking forward to hearing more about the Chandos 2040 strategy. This is a significant target and goal. Agreed. If it's okay, I think we'll go to the more targeted question next time, because I know that's on your website. So I'm just I'm just gonna breeze right by, but it is very exciting. This one's to Sarah. What exactly does a performance criteria look like? What should we ask for? EPDs, low carbon concrete is so vague. What would be a more actionable definition? That's from Elizabeth. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, EPDs certainly have evolved significantly over time, and our industry is deeply involved in a project right now that I believe David mentioned, the LCA Squared initiative with NRC. And we are working to update our data as our concrete suppliers across the country. So there is there's a lot of work around standardizing EPDs and ensuring that they are providing meaningful LCA data on product. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can approach a green procurement policy in a performance-based standard. I'll talk high level about a couple of them, but also just to say Elizabeth would be very happy to have an offline conversation because it can get quite detailed. So EPDs are a good way to get kind of your baseline or an understanding of what's possible, right? So in concrete, for example, because there's so much variation in different parts of the country, the production of a regionalized EPD will kind of give you a sense about what is possible in that particular part of the country that you're operating in. And then, similarly to the way that we look at carbon pricing, you establish a benchmark that kind of ratchets down over time, as Jen mentioned, as technology improves, as all the different ways that we can reduce our emissions improve, right? Our performance is going to improve over time. And so similar to a carbon price, right? You can ratchet down that benchmark. But there's a whole bunch of things. So that's kind of on the mandatory side. But there's a whole bunch of things that you can do in different policy approaches on the voluntary side, right? So asking, right? Saying, we're interested in what the embodied carbon or what the LCA impact of this product is. Could you just report on it? Is a great way to start. Another thing that has worked well in many jurisdictions is premiums. So, based on an EPD, if we set the benchmark at this, if you can show that you can beat, so if the benchmark is X, and if you can show that you can beat X by 5%, 10%, whatever, we are interested in providing you this sort of premium on the project. And so, when you start playing around with how you ask things and use a combination, I would say, of mandatory and voluntary, whether that be, price premiums or even just reporting that starts as voluntary and increases as mandatory over time, you can see it's been demonstrated in a number of jurisdictions, the types of performance improvements that you can get. And, in addition, how then like a public procurement policy can then spur innovation and continued action in industry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just follow up. There's another, I know it's not in order, but bear with me because it is performance spec related. So this one's to David. You mentioned that Dialog goes with performance-based approach for concrete specifications. Could you please elaborate on that? Do you set an embodied carbon limit on concrete specs? If so, what is the limit?
Yeah, so there's a couple different approaches we take to defining embodied carbon in our specs. And this is related to my previous gap that I related with regards to defining the baseline on our projects. So the first approach we take is to define a reduction versus baseline in our specs. Usually we have to do quite a bit of research to figure out what that baseline is in the market. And then we can specify, say, a 20% reduction versus that baseline as the performance requirement. The other approach that we've taken on a few projects is to actually ask for options in the specs. So option one would be, say, a 10% reduction versus baseline. Option two would be a 20% reduction versus baseline. And then you can really determine through that method during procurement what the cost is to achieve various reduction targets for concrete. So those are the two strategies we've been taking on our specs for procuring low carbon concrete. So I don't have an answer for what our baseline is because it depends on the market. It varies across wherever we're doing a project. So takes a bit of research at this time.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen. Kristen, can I direct the next one? I see one that has a good match.
Go ahead.
It's asking, where does integrated project delivery fit within embodied carbon landscape, from my friend Matt Delkey. And I think, Jen, you probably could be a good fit for this project delivery aspect.
Sure, I can answer that. And if anyone else wants to jump in, what I would say is that because IPD has, the risk reward component with the whole value chain, or some of the core value chain members part of that risk reward piece. What's interesting is what we're starting to see with very limited data points, but what looks like some of our projects that we've put into an LCA actually look like they have lower embodied carbon that are IPD projects. And the reason I think that is because you have a number of trade partners on board with designers, we're optimizing design with trades at the table. And then when it comes to actually putting in material, it's just a side benefit of people being a little more conscientious of the material they're putting in. And because there is a cost component to them, they're being thoughtful about that. We're also seeing less waste per square foot on those IPD projects. So that's just a weird, it wasn't even in projects that had embodied carbon in mind, but it appears to be a side benefit of them. So that's a couple small data points. I think at the end of the day, if you've got carbon as a line of sight, when you're making design decisions, as long as people understand there's a lot of no to low cost decisions you can make on any number of things, insulation, concrete, that you can start to make at the beginning, that the team understands and then can do the work in the first place and understand that. So if you have, superintendents and foremen on board understanding that right from the beginning, it means that they can execute the work in a way that they probably aren't connected with right now in almost any other delivery method. So I think, to me, IPD is the thing that helps to educate our industry, because there's people who get to be in the room who don't always get to be in that design room and understanding some of the conversations happening. And so until we exhaust all of those metrics that we can follow, until we exhaust the, having lower concrete in design. That's again, the thing is we don't want pricing. So designers don't want pricing that's coming back from people who don't understand that. And so if the general contractor is not on board during the buyout phase, how are we making sure that those questions are being asked? We can do that maybe in construction management, but we have to make sure it's a priority. So again, IPD, I think, much more focus on really optimizing use of materials, optimizing, and again, with that collaboration piece, we can do so much more innovatively. So I think it's not going to be the only delivery method we use going forward. Anything that's collaborative and can involve the supply chain, I think, is the way we need to go. Progressive design build also works great. So anyways, all of that to say that I think it is the way forward for us to really, if we want to accelerate the work we're doing, that's the way to accelerate it. It's not easy. It's time consuming. It takes a lot of work and effort to collaborate, but that's the way we're going to accelerate the work.
Perfect. I think we have one more question left. We have 2
There's
more minutes.
quite a few questions. There's some more in the
Yeah.
chat, so we're happy to stay in field, but I know people have time, so I'll just fly through here. There was one about, I just saw Sarah typing, so I was just saying what was the commonly used SCM in Alberta. Example in BC, it's almost always fly ash. So I don't know if there's a quick answer to that one, but
I think in Alberta, it's almost always fly ash as well.
perfect.
Yeah, like there's a little bit of silica fume and I think maybe a smidge of slag, but it's almost always fly ash.
Excellent. And then this one is actually in the chat, but it said, so I think more to a tool maybe, but what is the process for major municipalities in Alberta like Calgary to allow lower carbon cement within their tenders and specifications for all works, not just sidewalks? And that's from Ken.
It's a great question. I think, as I said, it's very limited knowledge and expertise in current market for that one. But I can only speak to our city procurement policies because my role with the city is to look at the city owned buildings, and so there are a number of ways we can add in the technical requirements, like a performance specifications, where on top of your concrete, say you have a 30 MPa concrete that David and his team will specify for the next building project. If you can also start specifying the maximum threshold of the embodied carbon that is allowed in there, I think that would be beneficial to reduce or start implementing the low carbon concrete.
Thank you. There's one more. Jen there's a few more, but we'll just keep going through until we go. Jen noted that simply using less concrete is an important option. Her example was a floor that was thinner towards the center. Is anyone on the panel examining using hollow walls or 3D construction printing as a carbon mitigation strategy and a way to build more while using less? That's from Ed.
I guess I'll start by tackling this one. So as a designer, we're always trying to balance construction effort versus costs, and typically the options that use less concrete usually require more construction effort. So whatever that may be, if it's a waffle slab or a rib slab or a bubble slab or a handful of other options. So I think this is where we can really engage with our partners in construction to understand what that balance is and where we can make those changes to really benefit reducing embodied carbon. So I guess in a nutshell, we try to evaluate all the options, and then it comes to a balance of what's constructible in the current market.
Thank you. I don't know if do you guys have time for a couple more? They look fairly quick. Don't want to overassume, but okay, there's one for I think the panel, but also mostly I guess from the beginning slides. A student is wondering what areas of the carbon life cycle, as shown in those graphics, do you feel are important but least addressed? And that's for, oh, sorry, it does say for any panelist.
Ignacio, do you mind pulling
Ignacio.
up can you pull up the graphic to remind us?
Sure.
I think one of the interesting points that Ignacio made was the relevance of transportation costs of aggregate, or not costs, but the embodied carbon related to transportation of aggregate. So I'd be curious to hear if the industry is planning to address that in any means.
So, I mean, it's definitely something that we've recognized, and it's definitely included in our net zero roadmap. I do think there is a bit of a technology gap in terms of what type of medium and heavy duty vehicle technology we'll be able to deploy. I think, electrification has its limits. So, you're primarily looking at a hydrogen-based fuel. There are a number of pilots. There's actually one of the largest pilots is in Alberta on hydrogen for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So it's definitely something that we've identified that needs to happen. It is absolutely a technology gap, but it is there. I don't really know what else to say, but certainly there's lots of public policy to back it up.
One thing that, sorry, Sarah, one of the things that I wanted to qualify is that we need to take, one of the things that was mentioned that everything, all the information that we see is relevant to a specific market and geographic area. The graph that you're seeing here is more specific to the prairies, because if you were to go to the coast, for instance, in Vancouver, the transportation of aggregates is not as impactful because you have waterways and to bring the material, which is a lot lower carbon intensity than either truck or rail for that matter. So again, take these things with a grain of salt because it's very specific to a market area, so that, if you're in Vancouver, things will look completely different if you're in the prairies or somewhere else.
I think maybe there's just one more question, but of course, please reach out and we'll connect you to the panelists. But just one that I think is important that just seemed to come up in the last couple there. Have you noticed any less performance in lower carbon concrete in general? Sorry, I think I'm paraphrasing a few of the questions there, but is there any lowered performance with that?
No, from my perspective, the answer is no, just because we haven't really used the low carbon concrete on our projects. But
I think there's a trade-off with anything. So certainly there's changes you can make to reduce embodied carbon that will have no impact to performance, and you can get exactly what you're hoping to achieve out of the performance of your concrete. There's other changes that you can make that, of course, will affect the durability or whatever it may be. So it's just really understanding what those are and working with the concrete suppliers to create that balance.
Yeah, I would be really curious that, learning about the long-term durability of that low carbon concrete, and only the time can tell after, 15, 20 years of service life, how your concrete actually withstood, our harsh climate in Alberta.
So, I mean, there are solutions that you can get today that reduce your reduce the carbon impact of your concrete that have no impact on performance. Like the use of Portland limestone cement, for example, gives you a 10% better emissions or gives you 10% emissions reduction for absolutely no change in performance and no change for cost. I think, as all my colleagues are jumping in on saying, we like to call it green for free. And so, there are many solutions available that do not impact performance at all.
Amazing. I think I'll, if it's okay, just timing wise, I think we'll have to shut it down. But of course, we're always open to questions. Please email us, and all our contact information is through the website. We look forward to any further questions, and we can connect you with the panelists. And that's all for now. We'll let everyone go. The recording will be up in the next couple of weeks here on the website. And thank you all so much for attending, and a big thank you to Ignacio for organizing and for all the panelists and their time. Thank you so much. It's been a really great discussion.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, panelists. It's been a pleasure and honor. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great evening.